A $1 powder can collapse an entire ant colony overnight, not by killing the ants you see, but by turning them into carriers. That's the part that feels wrong, because every instinct tells you to stop the movement immediately. You see a line of ants stretching across your counter, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, flowing in a tight, organized path toward a single crumb. You wipe them out, spray the surface, break the line, and for a moment, it looks like control. But that line was never the system. It was just the edge of it. Behind that thin trail is a multi-chamber colony, thousands of ants moving through walls, beneath floors, feeding, exchanging, sustaining something you never actually reach. And every time you kill them on contact, you're not collapsing that system, you're protecting it. Fast kill feels effective. It looks decisive. But biologically, it fails. The ants die before they can return, before they can share, before the colony is ever exposed. So, the only solution that works does the opposite. It lets them live just long enough to carry the powder back through the trail, into the nest, across the colony, spreading it from worker to worker, chamber to chamber, until the entire system begins to fail from within. Fast kills protect the colony, and solutions that work like this don't disappear by accident. They just don't align with how most systems are built to operate. Welcome to Trust, No Instinct. If questioning incentives matters, subscribing keeps this thinking alive. This idea isn't new. It only feels new because the context around it disappeared. In the late 1800s, U.S. agricultural practices were already using boric compounds inside grain storage systems, not as instant poisons, but as slow-moving agents. Mixed with bait, they were carried by insects back into hidden populations. The effect wasn't immediate, but within 48 to 72 hours, activity inside entire storage zones would begin to drop, not at the surface, inside the system. Because even then, the limitation was obvious. Killing what you could see didn't touch what sustained it. By the 1940s, that principle became operational. In World War II, supply bases and transport ships, infestations couldn't be managed with constant spraying. Resources were limited, environments were enclosed. So the approach shifted. Delayed action baits were deployed specifically because they could move through the population, carried, shared, redistributed. The solution didn't stop at contact, it traveled. And over time, infestations didn't just shrink. They collapsed from within, often without a visible moment of intervention. Activity would slow, trails would thin, entire zones would go quiet. No dramatic kill point, just absence. By the 1950s into the 1970s, urban entomology began mapping this behavior more precisely. Ant colonies were no longer seen as clusters, but as structured systems, multi-chamber nests, sometimes numbering in the thousands, connected through continuous food exchange. When a delayed toxicant entered that system, it didn't act locally, it propagated. Worker to worker, chamber to chamber, eventually reaching the reproductive core. That shift from contact kill to system collapse wasn't theoretical, it was measurable and consistent, which makes the trajectory that followed harder to ignore. If spread-based solutions were already understood, if collapse through delayed transfer was already observable, why did the most visible methods move toward speed instead? Why prioritize what looks immediate over what actually completes the job? Not because the earlier methods stopped working, but because something else fit the system better. What those early observations were pointing to wasn't just a trick, it was a system. Ant colonies don't behave like separate individuals. They function as a single distributed organism, thousands of bodies linked by constant movement, constant exchange. What looks like a thin line across your counter is actually a supply chain, dynamically adjusting in real time. And everything in that system is designed to move resources inward. When a worker ant finds food, it lays down a pheromone trail, a chemical path that turns one discovery into a reinforced route. Within minutes, that faint line becomes a dense stream. Dozens become hundreds, directed, efficient, relentless. But the real mechanism isn't the trail, it's what happens next. Because ants don't just carry food back, they distribute it. Through a process called trophallaxis, they exchange liquid food mouth to mouth, passing it between workers, larvae, and eventually the queen. One particle doesn't stay with one ant. It moves. And once it enters that network, it stops being local. It becomes systemic. That's where the $1 powder reveals what it actually is. Not a trick, not a hack, a compound, borax, sodium tetraborate, a naturally occurring mineral that behaves very differently from fast-acting sprays. When ants ingest it, nothing dramatic happens at first. No instant death, no visible reaction, which is exactly why it works, because it gives the system time to absorb it. And once it spreads, through trophallaxis, through the colony, it begins to act at a biological level. It disrupts digestion, interferes with enzyme function. The ants continue feeding, continue sharing, but can no longer process what they consume. They don't die immediately. They fail, slowly, silently, completely, until the very structure that sustains the colony begins to collapse from within. And here's where the story shifts. Because this mechanism never disappeared. It was renamed. Go to a hardware store. Pick up a $15 liquid ant bait station. Turn it around and read the label. You won't see borax. You'll see sodium tetraborate decahydrate, listed in small print, diluted into a sugar solution. The same compound, repackaged. A $1 mineral, dissolved, portioned into plastic, and scaled into a system that requires monitoring, replacing, repeating. The chemistry didn't change. The presentation did. What used to be a single, slow-moving solution became a cycle. Maintain, reapply, repeat. And if you've made it this far, you're starting to see the pattern most people never question. Once you see the mechanism clearly, the next part becomes harder to ignore, because this isn't just about what works, it's about what fits. The global pest control industry doesn't operate on one-time solutions. It operates on cycles: inspection, treatment, return visits, seasonal contracts. The model isn't built around elimination, it's built around maintenance. And somewhere along the way, the math becomes unavoidable. The global pest control market is a $25 billion industry. A standard residential service contract costs the average homeowner between $500 and $1,200 per year for quarterly treatments. Year after year, visit after visit. That entire structure depends on one quiet condition. The problem must return. And that changes everything. Because a solution that fully collapses a colony in one pass, for a single dollar, quietly, internally, without visible drama, doesn't fit cleanly into that system. It doesn't require scheduling. It doesn't create repeat demand. It doesn't sustain a cycle. It ends it. A spray does the opposite. You see ants, you spray, they die instantly. The feedback is immediate. The result is visible. It feels like control, but the colony survives. So the ants come back, and when they come back, the system continues. That's not a flaw. That's alignment, because once you step back, the pattern sharpens. Solutions that require repetition, monitoring, reapplication, ongoing service, scale predictably. They fit into contracts. They generate continuity. A $1 solution that works once doesn't. It doesn't expand. It doesn't compound. It doesn't belong. Completion breaks the model, and no one needs to hide that. The incentives already filter it. So, over time, the most visible solutions converge around what sustains the cycle, not necessarily what ends it. You're given tools that manage the surface, not tools that collapse the system, because one keeps you inside the loop, and the other removes you from it. So, the real question isn't whether the $1 powder works. It's why the solutions you see most often are designed to keep working. So, what does this actually look like in the real world? Not complicated, but very easy to get wrong, because the instinct you've been trained to follow will break the mechanism if you apply it here. The goal is not to kill the ants you see, it's to let them continue, just long enough. Here is exactly what you do, and it costs almost nothing. Go to the laundry aisle of any grocery store and buy a box of borax. It's usually around $5, and one box can last for years. At home, mix 1 part borax with 3 parts powdered sugar. The sugar is the bait, the borax is the vector. If you want it to spread faster, add a few drops of warm water to turn it into a thick syrup. If not, leave it dry. The ants don't care. What matters is that they carry it. Now you place a small amount of that mixture directly along the exact paths they're already using. Not randomly, not everywhere. On the active trail, near entry points, along baseboards where movement is already established. And then you do something that feels completely wrong. You don't interrupt it. No wiping, no spraying, no panic cleaning. Because the moment you break the trail, you break the transfer. And without transfer, there is no collapse. At first, nothing changes. The line is still there. In some cases, it looks worse. More ants, more movement, more doubt. But that's not failure. It's distribution. They're carrying it back, sharing it, feeding it through the colony, worker to worker, eventually reaching the queen. And then, the line thins, the movement slows, the return stops. But I need to be honest with you. This isn't instant. If the colony is large, or if multiple nests are feeding into the same space, it can take several days. If you interrupt the process too early, you reset the system and lose the spread. And if you expect immediate results, this will feel like it's not working, because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel like control. But what it delivers is something most solutions never reach, not speed, completion. And once you see it clearly, it's hard to unsee. Because this was never just about ants. It's about how easily we confuse what's visible with what's real. The movement on your counter feels like the problem. The quick fix feels like control. The instant result feels like success. But the system underneath doesn't care what you see. It responds to what reaches it. And most of the time, what reaches it is nothing. So, the surface resets again and again and again until the cycle feels normal. That's the part most people never question, not because it's hidden, but because it's familiar. But every now and then, something small breaks that pattern. A $1 powder, a delayed reaction, a solution that doesn't perform on the surface. Because it was never designed to. It performs underneath. And that shift, away from what looks effective, toward what actually completes the process, is where everything changes. Not just here, everywhere. Because the same pattern repeats in places you don't expect. Problems that are managed instead of solved. Systems that continue instead of ending. A $25 billion pest control industry depends on you focusing on the surface. $500 to $1,200 every year depends on you believing the problem can only be paused, never finished. But chemistry doesn't care about service contracts. And borax has never charged a subscription fee. The system runs on repetition. The solution ends it. Once you start seeing that pattern, you don't really go back. If this changed how you see simple problems, share it with someone who still trusts the surface. Because every single share puts a crack in the wall that keeps people stuck in the loop. And if you want to see what else works like this, subscribe to Trust No Instinct.